The matched set of Waterford crystal glasses, the ones I had bought for them as a housewarming gift, caught the light of the dining room chandelier, throwing fractured prisms across the mahogany table. The air in the room was heavy, thick with the smell of Chloe's catered truffle risotto and an unspoken, suffocating tension. I was 74 years old, a retired third-grade teacher, a widow of 10 years, and, until that exact moment, a mother who believed she had done everything right. Chloe, my daughter-in-law, picked up her linen napkin and dabbed carefully at the corners of her mouth so as not to ruin her perfectly applied plum lipstick. She set the napkin down, folded her hands, and looked across the table at me. There was no anger in her eyes. That was the worst part. There was only a terrifying, clinical indifference. "Maggie," she said, her voice smooth and even, like polished stone. "We need to be clear about the boundaries moving forward. Tom and I have discussed this. Our nuclear family, me, Tom, Ethan, and Lily, we are the priority. My family comes first. You come last." The words didn't just hang in the air. They struck me physically. I felt the breath leave my lungs as if I'd been shoved hard against a brick wall. My heart, which had beat steadily through 40 years of marriage, the grief of burying my husband Robert, and the exhaustion of raising a son on a teacher's salary, suddenly fluttered in a frantic, terrifying rhythm. "You come last." I didn't look at Chloe. I turned my head slowly, painfully, to look at my son. Thomas, my Tommy, the boy whose feverish forehead I had bathed with cool washcloths at 3 a.m. The boy whose college tuition I had helped pay by tutoring rich kids on the weekends. The man whose signature was on the deed of this magnificent, sprawling 5-bedroom house in Lake Forest. A deed made possible only because I had sold my own home and handed them the entire equity. He was sitting right next to her. He was swirling a very expensive Cabernet in his glass, watching the dark red liquid coat the crystal. I waited. The silence stretched out, punctuated only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. I waited for my son to put his glass down. I waited for the outrage to flush his cheeks. I waited for him to look at his wife and say, "Do not speak to my mother that way." He didn't. Tom kept his eyes fixed on his plate, staring at a stray grain of risotto, and cleared his throat. "Mom," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Chloe's right. We have to protect our peace. You've been a lot lately." Something inside my chest snapped. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a dramatic explosion of anger or a hysterical fit of tears. It was a quiet, structural collapse. A load-bearing pillar of my life had just given way, and the roof of my reality came crashing down into dust. I didn't cry. I think the shock froze the tears before they could form. I carefully placed my silver fork down on my plate. I smoothed my cardigan, stood up, and pushed my chair in. The scraping sound of the wood against the hardwood floor seemed deafening. "I understand," I said. My voice didn't shake. I sounded like Mrs. Hayes, the teacher who used to command a room full of rowdy 8-year-olds with a single word. "Thank you for dinner." I didn't wait for them to say anything else. I walked out of the dining room, down the sweeping hallway with its vaulted ceilings, and let myself out the heavy oak front door. The November air in Chicago hits you like a wet towel, but that night, I welcomed the biting cold. I walked down their meticulously manicured driveway, past Tom's imported SUV and Chloe's luxury crossover, and got into my 10-year-old Honda Civic. The engine sputtered in protest before turning over. Driving away from their neighborhood, the streetlights blurred into long streaks of amber. Lake Forest faded in my rearview mirror, the sprawling estates giving way to the darker, cramped, older neighborhoods on the outskirts of the city. 30 minutes later, I pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of my apartment building. It was a stark contrast. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of a walk-up that always smelled faintly of old cabbage and industrial bleach. There was a flickering neon sign from the liquor store across the street that cast a persistent, sickly green glow through my thin living room curtains. I unlocked my deadbolt, walked inside, and didn't turn on the lights. I just sat on the edge of my worn-out sofa, wearing my coat, and stared into the dark. 5 years. It had been 5 years since Robert passed away from a sudden heart attack. He had always been the anchor, the one who handled the finances, the one who told me I was too soft, too giving. When he died, the silence in our old 4-bedroom house in Oak Park had been deafening. That was when Tom had come to me, sitting at my kitchen table, holding my hands. He looked so much like his father in that moment. "Mom, you shouldn't be alone in this big house," he had said, his eyes full of what I thought was genuine concern. "Chloe and I want to buy our forever home. We want to be in the Lake Forest School District for the kids. We want a house with a mother-in-law suite. You sell this place, help us with the down payment, and you'll never have to worry about a thing. We'll take care of you." I wanted to believe him. I wanted the noise of grandchildren in the hallway. I wanted the warmth of a family. So I sold the house Robert and I had spent 30 years paying off. It cleared just over $300,000 in equity. I gave Tom and Chloe $300,000. I kept barely $20,000 for myself, thinking I would only need to rent a tiny place for a few months while their new house was being finalized and the mother-in-law suite was being painted. But the suite never materialized. First, Chloe decided she needed a home office for her freelance consulting. Then Tom needed a home gym. "Just give us another year, Mom," Tom had promised, avoiding my eyes. "You're doing fine in the apartment, right? It's just temporary." Temporary turned into 5 years. And in those 5 years, I became the family's unpaid machinery. Sitting in the dark of my living room, the memories of my servitude washed over me, bitter and stinging. I was the ghost that kept their perfect suburban life running. Every Sunday, I drove my rattling car to their mansion. I brought groceries, bought from my meager Social Security check, and spent the afternoon meal prepping for their week. I made casseroles, baked ziti, roasted chickens. While I scrubbed their granite countertops and folded mountains of Egyptian cotton towels, Tom was at the country club playing 18 holes. Chloe was at the day spa, or at brunch with the other Lake Forest wives, drinking mimosas and complaining about how stressful her life was. I tutored Ethan in algebra when Tom claimed he was too tired from work. I sat on the floor for hours teaching Lily how to French braid her hair because Chloe said she didn't have the patience for it. I was essential, but entirely invisible. I was the plumbing. You only notice it when it stops working. And they never hesitated to critique my free labor. I remembered a Tuesday afternoon just last month. I had driven over in a rainstorm because Chloe's nanny had called in sick. I had bought strawberries for the kids' snack. Chloe had walked into the kitchen, picked up the plastic container, and sighed heavily. "Maggie, really? These aren't organic. You know we only feed the kids organic produce. The pesticides in these are basically poison. Just throw them out." She had tossed the strawberries, which had cost me $6 I shouldn't have spent, straight into the designer trash can. I had swallowed my pride and apologized. But over the last few weeks, before the dinner, the dynamic had begun to shift. The casual exploitation turned into active avoidance. Whenever I called just to say hello, it went to voicemail. Whenever I asked if I could take Ethan and Lily for ice cream, there was a sudden, vague excuse. "Lily has ballet. Ethan is studying. We're just having a quiet nuclear family weekend." I had started to feel a terrible hollow ache in my chest. I had started to suspect that my usefulness had run its course. The kids were older now. They didn't need a babysitter as often. And my bank account was drained. I couldn't afford to bring them expensive gifts anymore. The dinner tonight wasn't an invitation to connect. It was a formal excommunication. "You're a lot lately." Tom's cowardly words echoed in the quiet of my apartment. I stood up, my joints stiff from the cold, and finally turned on the small brass lamp on my side table. The amber light fell onto a framed photograph of Robert and me on our 30th anniversary. Robert was smiling, his arm wrapped tightly around my waist. "You were right, Bobby," I whispered to the empty room. I was too soft. I walked into my cramped kitchenette, poured myself a glass of tap water, and drank it down. The shock was entirely gone now. In its place, a cold, hard, metallic clarity began to form. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced since I was a young woman, fighting for a place in the world. For 5 years, I had shrunk myself to fit into the margins of their lives. I had allowed myself to be bled dry, emotionally, physically, and financially, because I was terrified of losing the only family I had left. I had let a selfish daughter-in-law and a weak-willed son treat me like a disposable appliance. But as I stood there in the flickering green light of the liquor store sign, I made a promise to myself. If I was truly the last thing on their list, then my obligations to them were officially over. The free babysitting was over. The cooked meals were over. The desperate attempts to buy their love were over. I was done. I walked over to the calendar hanging on the fridge and took a red marker. I crossed out the coming Sunday. No more dinners. No more visits. Let them see how their perfect, polished life runs without the engine they threw away. I went to sleep that night with a dry face and a steady heart. I thought I knew exactly how bad things were. I thought the worst they had done was break my heart and steal my home. I was wrong. The real betrayal was still waiting for me, buried in a digital file I wasn't even supposed to see. The first week of my self-imposed exile passed in a silence so profound it actually made my ears ring. I didn't call. I didn't text. I didn't buy the Sunday roast or show up at their doorstep with my usual Tupperware containers of homemade food. A small, pathetic part of me, the mother who still remembered the weight of her newborn son on her chest, thought that maybe, just maybe, Tom would notice my absence. I thought he might call, perhaps a little sheepish, to ask if I was feeling all right, or to apologize for Chloe's cruelty. The phone never rang. The silence was their answer. It was a confirmation that I had never been a mother or a grandmother to them. I had been a utility. And now that the utility had been unplugged, they simply went about their lives in their sprawling Lake Forest home, unbothered by the darkness of my tiny apartment. By the second week, the initial hollow ache in my chest had hardened into a dull, manageable callus. I started taking morning walks to the local park, reading paperback mysteries I bought for $1 at the thrift store, and drinking my coffee hot for a change, instead of rushing to get it down before driving out to the suburbs. I was surviving. I was adapting. Then came the Tuesday that shattered whatever illusion of peace I had managed to scrape together. It was raining. A cold, relentless Chicago sleet that battered the single-pane window of my living room. I was sitting on my worn sofa, wrapped in a knitted afghan, trying to pass the time on an old, cracked iPad. Ethan had left it at my apartment nearly a year ago. It was an outdated model, too slow for his video games, so he had casually abandoned it on my coffee table. I had charged it up and used it mostly to play solitaire and read the digital newsletter from my retired teachers association. Because Tom had set the device up for me, it was still logged into my primary email account. I was halfway through a game of solitaire when a banner notification slid down from the top of the screen. I almost swiped it away, assuming it was junk mail, but the logo caught my eye. It was from First National, the bank where I held my one remaining asset, my emergency fund. When I sold the house in Oak Park and gave Tom the $300,000, I had quietly tucked away $50,000. It was everything Robert and I had left in liquid savings. I never touched it. I never even looked at it. That money was my absolute bottom line. It was my guarantee that if I ever got truly sick, I wouldn't be a burden. It was the money that would pay for my funeral, so my son wouldn't have to put my burial on a credit card. It was my dignity, sitting quietly in a high-yield savings account, gathering a few dollars of interest a month. The subject line of the email read, "Urgent. Overdraft notice on account ending in 4402. I stared at the screen, my brow furrowing in confusion. Overdraft? That was impossible. You can't overdraw an account you never withdraw from. I tapped the notification with a trembling finger. The email loaded, sterile and automated. Dear Margaret Hayes, your savings account ending in 4402 has fallen below the minimum balance requirement and currently holds a negative balance of minus $34.50. An overdraft fee of $35 has been applied. Please make a deposit immediately to avoid further charges." A cold sweat broke out across my hairline. The air in the apartment suddenly felt too thin to breathe. My chest tightened, a phantom grip squeezing my lungs. $50,000. It couldn't be gone. It had to be a mistake, a computer glitch, a routing error. My first instinct, ingrained by decades of habit, was to pick up my phone and call Tom. "Tommy, there's something wrong with the bank. Can you fix it?" I actually had the phone in my hand, my thumb hovering over his contact name. Then the memory of Chloe's cold eyes and Tom's cowardly stare flashed in my mind. "You come last." I put the phone down. I was 74, but my mind was still sharp. If there was a problem with my life, I was going to fix it myself. I went to my bedroom, dressed in my warmest wool slacks and a heavy winter coat, and ordered an Uber. The 20-minute ride to the First National branch in downtown Chicago felt like a lifetime. I watched the windshield wipers aggressively push away the sleet, my hands gripping my leather purse so tightly my knuckles ached. The bank was brightly lit, smelling of floor wax and ozone. It was a stark contrast to the storm outside. I bypassed the teller line and walked straight up to the customer service desk. A young woman with a neat bob and a name tag that read Jessica looked up from her monitor. "Can I help you, ma'am?" she asked, offering a practiced, polite smile. "I hope so," I said, my voice betraying a slight tremor I fought hard to suppress. "I received an email saying my savings account is overdrawn. There has to be a mistake. I haven't touched that account in over 2 years. There should be just over $50,000 in it." Jessica's smile faltered slightly, sensing the rising panic in my tone. "Of course, let's take a look. I just need your ID and your debit card." I handed her my driver's license. She typed rapidly on her keyboard, her eyes scanning the screen. I watched her face. I watched as her expression shifted from polite customer service neutrality to a slight frown, and then to genuine discomfort. The clicking of her keyboard slowed, then stopped entirely. "Mrs. Hayes," Jessica began, her voice dropping an octave, taking on a gentle, cautious tone that terrified me more than screaming would have. "I'm looking at the account history. There hasn't been $50,000 in this account for quite some time." "What do you mean?" I demanded, leaning forward over the desk. "Where did it go? Was I hacked? Was it stolen?" "Ma'am, the withdrawals were all authorized," Jessica said softly, turning her monitor slightly so I could see the screen, though the numbers blurred together without my reading glasses. "They are a series of online transfers and wire payments spanning the last 24 months. "Authorized by who?" I snapped, the volume of my voice drawing the attention of a security guard near the door. "I don't even use online banking for that account. I don't have the password." Jessica swallowed hard. She clicked another tab on her screen. "The transfers were authorized by Thomas Hayes. He is listed as a joint account holder with full signing authority under a durable power of attorney, filed with this branch 2 years ago." The floor beneath my feet felt like it simply ceased to exist. I gripped the edge of Jessica's desk to keep from swaying. 2 years ago. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had slipped on a patch of black ice on my apartment stairs and fractured my hip. I was in the hospital, recovering from the replacement surgery. I was hooked up to IV drips, swimming in a hazy, painkiller-induced fog. Tom had come to visit me. He had brought flowers and a manila folder. "Mom," he had said, holding my hand, playing the part of the devoted son. "The hospital administration is driving me crazy with paperwork. If something happens, or if they need to adjust your Medicare billing while you're asleep, I need authorization to handle it. The lawyer drafted this up. It just lets me talk to the billing department and your insurance." I hadn't read it. I couldn't even keep my eyes open for more than 5 minutes at a time. I had trusted my son. I had signed where he pointed. A notary from the hospital staff had stamped it. It wasn't a medical authorization. It was a general durable power of attorney. I had handed him the keys to my entire life while I lay bleeding in a hospital bed. "Print it," I whispered, my voice sounding like dry leaves. "Print everything. Every statement, every transfer, every single dime he took for the last 2 years. I want it all on paper." Jessica nodded quickly. "Of course, Mrs. Hayes. It will take a few minutes. Why don't you have a seat in my cubicle?" She led me to a private desk tucked away in the back. I sat down in a rigid leather chair and waited. My mind was racing, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. He had stolen from me, my own flesh and blood. While I was clipping coupons to buy them groceries, while I was taking the bus to save gas money, he was quietly siphoning off my funeral money. Jessica returned with a thick stack of paper, still warm from the printer. She laid them on the desk in front of me. "I went back to the first major withdrawal 22 months ago," she explained gently. "I can walk you through it if you'd like." "No," I said firmly, reaching into my purse for my reading glasses. "I can read." I began to turn the pages. The betrayal wasn't a single massive theft. It was methodical. It was a parasitic draining. It started small. $2,000 transferred to Tom's personal checking account. Memo, roof repair. Another $1,000 a month later. Memo, Ethan's tuition deposit. I could almost hear the lies he told himself, that he was just borrowing it, that he would put it back when his bonus came through. But then, as I flipped to the second year, the pattern changed. The numbers grew larger, more frantic, and the destinations of the money painted a horrifying picture. This was the second twist of the knife, and it cut deeper than the first. I had assumed in my bitterest thoughts that Tom was stealing my money to fund Chloe's lavish lifestyle. I pictured my $50,000 turning into Louis Vuitton handbags, spa retreats, and cases of imported wine. But the bank statements told a very different, much darker story. There were wire transfers for $3,000 to a company called Apex Debt Recovery. There were multiple recurring payments of $500 and $800 to high-interest short-term lending agencies, the kind of predatory payday loans that people only use when they are desperate and out of options. Then came the largest chunks. $10,000 gone in a single day, $5,000 2 weeks later. The vendor names were cryptic, but Jessica, who had been quietly watching me read, leaned in and pointed to them. "Mrs. Hayes," she said softly, "those transfers there, Coinbase, Kraken, and TD Ameritrade Margin, those are cryptocurrency and high-risk day trading platforms. Usually when we see a pattern like this, large sums moving to these platforms combined with payments to debt collectors, it means he's broke." I finished her sentence, the realization washing over me like ice water. I stared at the black ink on the white paper. The picture of my son's life completely shattered and reformed before my eyes. Tom wasn't a wealthy, successful executive. He was a fraud. He and Chloe were drowning. The massive 5-bedroom house, the country club membership, the luxury cars, it was all a facade, built on a foundation of massive, unmanageable debt. Tom hadn't just been stealing my money to buy luxuries. He had been stealing my money to throw into the black hole of his own financial failures. He had been day trading my emergency fund, gambling with my life savings, trying to win back the money he owed, and he had lost all of it, every last cent. Suddenly, their behavior over the last few months made perfect, sickening sense. They hadn't cut me out just because I was annoying or a lot. They had cut me out because the well had finally run dry. There was no more money left to steal. And Chloe's cruel words at the dinner table wasn't just arrogance. It was a desperate, panicked woman lashing out at the only person she could still look down on. My funeral money went to debt collectors. My safety net vanished into the digital ether of a crypto crash. I sat back in the leather chair and closed my eyes. I felt a tear, hot and sharp, trace a line down my wrinkled cheek. I let it fall, but I didn't wipe it away. Jessica handed me a tissue. "Mrs. Hayes, I am so incredibly sorry. Because he had the power of attorney, the bank viewed these transactions as authorized, but this is financial abuse. You can file a police report." I opened my eyes. The sadness, the grief of losing the son I thought I knew, was evaporating. In its place, a fire was starting to burn. It was a cold, bright, relentless fire. For 5 years, they had taken my home. For 2 years, they had secretly taken my life savings. They had looked me in the eye, eaten the food I bought for them, and let me believe I was a burden, all while using my blood to keep their dying lifestyle on life support. "Mrs. Hayes?" Jessica asked softly. "What do you want to do?" I gathered the warm stack of bank statements and tapped them against the desk, aligning the edges perfectly. I placed them into my purse and snapped the clasp shut. "I want to revoke that power of attorney immediately," I said, my voice steady, stripped of all warmth. "I want to close this account and any other account my son's name is attached to. And then, Jessica, you are going to help me find the address for the nearest police precinct." I didn't raise a thief. I raised a man who chose to become one. And it was time he learned that the woman he put last was the only one who had the power to destroy him. The walk from the bank to the local police precinct was only 4 blocks, but it felt like dragging my body across a desert. The adrenaline that had fueled my outrage in Jessica's cubicle was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a sickening, hollow exhaustion. Filing a police report against your own child is a specific kind of hell. It goes against every biological instinct a mother possesses. You are programmed to protect them, to hide their flaws, to take the hit so they don't have to. Walking through the heavy glass doors of the precinct, smelling the stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner, I felt like I was walking to my own execution. The desk sergeant, a weary-looking man with graying temples, listened to my story. He looked at the thick stack of bank statements I pushed across the scratched plexiglass. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice softer than his gruff appearance suggested. Because he had a signed power of attorney, this isn't a simple smash and grab. It borders on a civil dispute. To make criminal fraud and elder abuse charges stick, you need an airtight case. You need to prove you were of sound mind when you revoked it today, and you need legal counsel to ensure he doesn't try to use that same document to claim you're incompetent to press charges. He handed the papers back to me. I'm assigning this to a detective in the financial crimes unit, but before we knock on his door with handcuffs, you need to lock down every other aspect of your life. Get a lawyer. A good one. And don't let him know you're on to him until the trap is fully set. I took the papers. I understood. This wasn't going to be a quick Band-Aid pulled off. This was going to be a surgery. I took the bus back to my apartment. By the time I unlocked my door, the sleet had turned into a heavy, wet snow. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't make tea. I sat in the armchair by the window, my coat still on, and waited. I knew it wouldn't take long. I had closed the account and revoked his access at 11 a.m. At 4:15 p.m., the heavy, frantic pounding on my apartment door began. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the aggressive, entitled hammering of a man who was used to getting his way and was currently in a state of sheer panic. "Mom, open the door!" Tom's voice was muffled through the cheap wood, but the frantic edge was unmistakable. "Mom, I know you're in there! Open up!" I took a slow, deep breath. I felt my pulse throbbing in my throat. I stood up, smoothed my slacks, and walked to the door. I unlatched the deadbolt and pulled it open, leaving the chain on. Tom's face was flushed, his hair damp from the snow. He was wearing his expensive camel hair overcoat, but his tie was loosened, and his eyes were wild. "What did you do?" he demanded, not even offering a greeting. He pushed his face closer to the crack in the door. "I just tried to log into the First National account to handle a vendor payment, and it says the account is frozen. It says my access is revoked." "What the hell did you tell the bank, Mom?" I looked at the boy I had raised. I looked past the expensive coat and the designer haircut, and I saw exactly what he was, a frightened, pathetic thief who had just been caught. I unhooked the chain and swung the door wide open. "Come in, Thomas." He stepped inside, bringing the smell of cold air and expensive cologne into my cramped living room. He didn't take his coat off. He paced the small patch of threadbare rug, rubbing his face. "Mom, you need to call the bank right now and fix this. You don't understand. I have a massive transfer that needs to clear by 5 p.m., or we are going to be in serious trouble." "We?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. I walked over to the small dining table and picked up the thick manila envelope I had brought back from the bank. "There is no we, Thomas. There is you, and there is the $50,000 of my money you stole to pay off your gambling debts." Tom froze. He stopped pacing. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. He stared at the envelope in my hand. I pulled out the bank statements and tossed them onto the table. They fanned out, a paper trail of his betrayal. "Coinbase, Apex Debt Recovery, Payday Loans," I read off the top page, not breaking eye contact. 2 years, Tommy. For 2 years you've been siphoning my funeral money to cover your day trading losses. You lied to me in a hospital bed to get that power of attorney. You let Chloe treat me like dirt while you were secretly bankrupting me. I waited for the shame. I waited for him to fall to his knees, to beg for forgiveness, to cry. I waited for the son I loved to surface through the wreckage. He didn't. Instead, I watched his face contort. The panic vanished, replaced by a cold, desperate calculation. His jaw tightened and he stood up straighter, looming over me in the small room. "You're confused, Mom," he said. His voice had lost its frantic edge and dropped into a condescending, terrifyingly calm register. "Excuse me?" I said, stunned by the sheer audacity. "I said you're confused." Tom stepped closer, pointing a finger at the bank statements. "We talked about this. Don't you remember? Months ago. You told me that sitting in a low-yield savings account was a waste. You asked me to invest it for you. You authorized every single one of those trades." I stared at him, my mouth slightly open in disbelief. "I did no such thing. I don't even know how to use an iPad properly, let alone trade cryptocurrency." "Mom, please," Tom sighed, running a hand through his hair, playing the part of the exhausted, patient son perfectly. "Your memory has been slipping lately. Chloe and I have been talking about it. You forget things, you get dates mixed up. You told me to use that money to help the family." Gaslighting. The word flashed in my mind. I had read about it in my psychology books years ago. It's the weapon of abusers, designed to make the victim doubt their own sanity. He wasn't just stealing from me, he was trying to erase my reality. "Do not lie to me in my own home," I said, my voice rising, the anger finally breaking through. "I know exactly what you did. I have my mind, Thomas. I'm going to the police." Tom's eyes went dead. All the warmth, all the familial connection, vanished in an instant. He took another step forward, backing me against the kitchen counter. He was 6'2". I was 5'4". For the first time in his life, I was physically afraid of my own son. "You're not going to the police," he said, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. "Because if you do, I will show them the power of attorney. And then I will tell them the truth, that my elderly mother is suffering from severe dementia, that she's paranoid, that she's making up delusions about me stealing from her." He leaned in closer. "I still have the medical directives, Mom. If you push this, if you try to ruin me, I will have you declared legally incompetent. Do you know what happens then? I take full conservatorship. I sell your car. I cancel your lease. And I will put you in a state-run facility so fast your head will spin. One of those places with linoleum floors that smell like urine, where they drug you to sleep at 8 p.m. Is that what you want?" The room seemed to tilt. The cruelty of his words was so absolute, so suffocating, I couldn't breathe. He wasn't just threatening to keep the money. He was threatening to take my freedom. He was willing to lock me away in a nightmare, to strip me of my human rights, just to keep himself out of jail and his country club membership intact. This was the climax of my grief. In that horrifying moment, standing against my cheap Formica counter, I realized that Thomas Hayes, the boy who used to pick me dandelions from the yard, was dead. The man standing in front of me was a monster wearing his skin. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to slap him, to scream, to fight back. But the desk sergeant's warning echoed in my ears. "You need an airtight case. You need to prove you were of sound mind. Don't let him know you're onto him until the trap is fully set." If I fought him now, he would leave, call his expensive lawyers, and immediately start the process of having me declared incompetent. He had the money, my money, and the connections. I was an old woman living alone. The system would believe the well-dressed executive over the hysterical old widow. I needed time. I needed a lawyer. I needed to play the hardest game of my life. So I didn't scream. I didn't slap him. I did something much harder. I broke. I let my shoulders slump. I let the righteous anger drain out of my face, replacing it with wide-eyed, trembling panic. I raised a shaking hand to my mouth. "Tommy?" I whispered, making my voice fragile and thin. "Tommy, what are you saying? A facility?" Tom watched me closely, his eyes narrowing, searching for a trap. But I was a teacher. I had spent 40 years reading the emotions of children, and I knew how to project them. I let a tear spill over my eyelid. I don't remember telling you to invest it," I stammered, looking down at my hands as if they didn't belong to me. Did I? Did I tell you that?" The tension in Tom's shoulders instantly evaporated. The monster receded, and the arrogant, patronizing son returned. He let out a long, heavy sigh. "Yes, Mom, you did," he said, his voice softening into fake sympathy. He reached out and patted my shoulder. I had to bite the inside of my cheek until it bled to keep from pulling away from his touch. "You're just confused. It's okay. Getting older is hard." "But the bank," I whimpered, wrapping my cardigan tighter around myself. "The lady at the bank told me to freeze it. She scared me, Tommy." "Bank tellers don't know anything," Tom scoffed, completely buying my performance. "Listen, I need you to unfreeze that account tomorrow. I can't do it because you locked me out. You need to call them and tell them it was a misunderstanding, okay?" "Okay," I whispered, looking at the floor. "Tomorrow. I'll do it tomorrow. I'm just so tired right now. My head hurts." "I know, Mom," he said, turning toward the door. He actually sounded relieved. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully bullied a confused old woman back into her box. "Just rest. I'll call you in the morning to make sure you contact the bank. And Mom?" He paused with his hand on the doorknob. "Let's just keep this between us. No need to upset Chloe." "Of course, Tommy," I murmured. He opened the door and walked out. I listened to his heavy footsteps echo down the hallway, followed by the clatter of the stairwell door closing. I stood frozen in the middle of my living room for a full minute, ensuring he was gone. Then the trembling stopped. The tears dried instantly. I stood up perfectly straight, my spine stiff as a steel rod. I walked over to the kitchen sink and spat the blood from my bitten cheek down the drain. He wanted to play a game of survival. He wanted to see who was smarter, who was more ruthless. He had no idea who he was dealing with. I walked to my small desk in the corner of the room, opened the phone book, and flipped to the government pages. I didn't look up a private lawyer I couldn't afford. I looked up the Legal Aid Society of Chicago, specifically the Division for Elder Rights and Financial Exploitation. I had bought myself 3 days. Tomorrow was Wednesday. I would tell him the bank needed me to come in person on Friday to lift the freeze. That gave me 72 hours. 72 hours to meet with a pro bono attorney. 72 hours to draft a bulletproof revocation of all medical and financial directives. 72 hours to undergo a psychiatric evaluation to prove on paper that my cognitive functions were flawless, thereby destroying his threat of a conservatorship. I picked up the phone and dialed the number. "You come last." Chloe's words whispered through the dark apartment. Not anymore. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in deception, fueled by a terrifying cold adrenaline I hadn't felt since I was a young woman. When Tom called me on Wednesday morning, his voice dripping with that fake patronizing warmth, I played my part flawlessly. I made my voice shake. I told him the bank manager was at a regional conference and couldn't process the unfreeze authorization until Friday afternoon. "Friday?" Tom had snapped, his patience fraying. "Mom, I told you I have a deadline." "I'm sorry, Tommy," I had whimpered, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper of my kitchen. "They said there's a mandatory holding period because of my age. I'm trying, I promise. Friday at 3 o'clock, they said." He cursed under his breath, a sharp, ugly sound, but he bought it. He told me to stay put and not to speak to anyone else at the bank. I agreed, hung up, and immediately left my apartment. I didn't waste a single second. I took 3 different buses to downtown Chicago to avoid leaving a digital trail on an Uber account he might have access to. My first stop was a geriatric psychiatrist recommended by the Legal Aid Society. The doctor, a sharp-eyed woman my age named Dr. Aris, put me through a grueling 2-hour cognitive evaluation. I answered questions, drew clock faces, recited memory sequences, and discussed current events. When we were finished, she handed me a sealed, notarized medical affidavit. It stated unequivocally that Margaret Hayes was of perfectly sound mind, entirely capable of managing her own affairs, and showed absolutely 0 signs of dementia or cognitive decline. Tom's weapon was neutralized. My second stop was the legal aid office. I sat across from a young, fiercely intelligent pro bono attorney named Sarah. Together, we drafted a total revocation of the power of attorney and a cease and desist order. Sarah also contacted First National Bank directly, bypassing the local branch managers, to place a hard fraud lock on my Social Security number and all associated accounts. By Thursday evening, the trap was fully set. All I had to do was wait for Friday morning to walk into the police precinct and sign the formal criminal complaint. I was sitting in my armchair, watching the snow pile up against the window pane, when the knock came. It was 8 p.m. It was too soft to be Tom. He always knocked like he was trying to break the door down. This was a rapid, anxious tapping. I walked to the door and peered through the peephole. It was Chloe. She was standing in the dim hallway, wearing a beige cashmere trench coat that cost more than my first car. But the polished, untouchable Lake Forest wife I had seen at the dinner table was gone. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy, frantic knot. Her mascara was slightly smudged. She looked like a woman who had just watched her house burn down. I opened the door, keeping the chain fastened. "What do you want, Chloe?" "Maggie, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. She looked over her shoulder as if she expected the neighbors to be spying on her. "Let me in. Tom doesn't know I'm here. I have to talk to you." A part of me, the soft, foolish part that had allowed myself to be used for 5 years, felt a sudden pang of sympathy. Had she found out? Had she discovered that her husband was a fraud? That their wealth was a lie? That he had stolen from his own mother? I imagined she had come to apologize, to cry with me, to figure out how we were going to survive the wreckage of Tom's actions. I unlatched the chain and let her in. Chloe stepped into the cramped living room, her eyes darting around the cheap furniture and the water stains on the ceiling. She clutched a leather portfolio tightly against her chest. "I know everything," she said, turning to face me. "The bank called Tom's cell phone today while he was in the shower. I answered it. It was a fraud investigator. They told me the accounts were locked pending a criminal inquiry." I crossed my arms. "Then you know your husband is a thief." Chloe closed her eyes, letting out a ragged breath. I confronted him. He broke down. He told me about the crypto, the day trading, the payday loans. and you're $50,000. I see, I said, waiting for the apology, waiting for her to say she was leaving him, or that she was sorry for telling me I came last, knowing now that my money had been secretly funding her lifestyle. Instead, Chloe unzipped the leather portfolio. She pulled out a single sheet of paper and laid it on my small dining table. Maggie, you have to sign this. I walked over and looked at the document. It was a formal gift letter. It was typed out, backdated by 2 years, stating that Margaret Hayes willingly and joyfully gifted the sum of $50,000 to Thomas Hayes for the purpose of financial investments, with no expectation of repayment. I stared at the paper, then slowly looked up at Chloe's face. The sympathy I had felt just moments ago evaporated into the cold, stale air of the apartment. You want me to commit perjury, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. You want me to sign a legal document lying about the fact that my son stole my life savings. It's not a lie if you make it the truth right now, Chloe said, her voice rising in panic. She stepped toward me, her manicured hands pleading. Maggie, listen to me. If you go to the police, if you press charges, Tom goes to prison. Do you understand that? It's grand larceny. It's a felony. I am well aware of the law, I replied. Then you know he'll lose his job. The firm will fire him immediately. We won't be able to pay the mortgage. We'll lose the house. We'll lose the country club membership. Ethan will be pulled out of his private school in the middle of the semester. Lily won't be able to go to her ballet academy. We will have nothing, Maggie. We will be bankrupt and publicly humiliated. There it was. She wasn't here because she was heartbroken by her husband's betrayal. She wasn't here to protect the sanctity of her marriage. She was here because her country club membership was in jeopardy. She was terrified of losing the facade. She was terrified that the other Lake Forest wives would find out she was married to a broke, gambling fraud. So to save you from embarrassment, I am supposed to lose everything? I asked, pointing a trembling finger at my own chest. That was my funeral money, Chloe. That was my safety net. And you want me to just hand it over to you so you don't have to pull your daughter out of ballet? Chloe's face hardened. The desperate, pleading daughter-in-law vanished, and the arrogant woman from the dinner table returned. She crossed her arms, her jaw setting into a stubborn, ugly line. You're an old woman, Maggie. You live in a rent-controlled apartment. What do you even need $50,000 for? To sit in a bank account until you die? She stepped closer, trying to use her height to intimidate me, just like Tom had. Think about your grandchildren. If you do this, you are ruining Ethan and Lily's lives. You are choosing to destroy their future over your own selfish pride. The sheer audacity of it left me breathless for a fraction of a second. They had used me. They had drained me. And now they were trying to weaponize my love for my grandchildren to shield themselves from the consequences of their own actions. I am not destroying their lives, Chloe, I said, my voice ringing out clear and strong in the small room. You and Tom did that. You built a house of cards on a foundation of lies and theft. And now that the wind is blowing, you want me to lay my body down to stop it from falling. I picked up the gift letter, tore it cleanly in half, and let the pieces flutter to the floor between us. I'm not doing it. Chloe stared at the torn paper on the floor. Her face went pale, then flushed with a venomous, panicked rage. You vindictive old witch, she hissed, her hands balling into fists. You're going to regret this. I swear to God you will never see those kids again. I will tell them their grandmother went crazy and tried to put their father in jail. They will learn the truth eventually, I said, stepping past her and opening my front door. And they will learn that actions have consequences. Now get out of my apartment before I call the police and have you arrested for witness tampering. She glared at me, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, before storming out into the hallway. I slammed the door behind her and threw the deadbolt. My heart was hammering, but my hands were completely steady. The last lingering thread of doubt, the last ounce of maternal guilt I had been carrying, was gone. They were not victims of circumstance. They were predators who had gotten caught in their own trap. The next morning was Friday. The air in Chicago was bitterly cold, the sky a bruised, cloudless purple. I met Sarah, my legal aid attorney, at the precinct at 9 a.m. sharp. Detective Miller, a seasoned investigator with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, led us into a small interview room. I slid the medical affidavit across the metal table, proving my competency. Then Sarah presented the revoked power of attorney and the bank records. I answered his questions for 2 hours. I didn't cry. I didn't falter. I laid out the timeline, the theft, and Tom's threats of forcing me into a facility. When it was over, Detective Miller slid a typed criminal complaint across the table. It charged Thomas Hayes with grand larceny, elder financial exploitation, and fraud. "Mrs. Hayes," the detective said, handing me a black pen. "Once you sign this, it's out of your hands. The district attorney takes over. We will issue an arrest warrant today. Are you absolutely certain?" I thought of Robert working 50-hour weeks to pay off our mortgage. I thought of the 5 years of scrubbing Chloe's floors. I thought of Tom looming over me, threatening to lock me in a home. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," I said. I signed my name, Margaret Elizabeth Hayes. It felt like signing the Declaration of Independence. Sarah walked me to the bus stop, giving my hand a reassuring squeeze before she headed to the courthouse. I took the bus back to my apartment. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel happy. I felt profoundly, deeply exhausted. But for the first time in years, the air in my lungs felt clean. At 3 p.m., the time Tom believed I was at the bank unfreezing his stolen funds, I was sitting in my armchair with a cup of chamomile tea. At 4:15 p.m., my cell phone rang. It was Detective Miller. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice professional and brisk. "I wanted to let you know it's done. We picked him up 10 minutes ago." "Did he resist?" I asked quietly. "No, ma'am. He was shocked, mostly." The detective paused, and I could hear the faint sound of sirens in the background of his call. "We arrested him at the Oakwood Country Club. He was on the putting green with 3 other gentlemen. It was very public." I closed my eyes. I could see it perfectly. Tom, in his pressed polo shirt and expensive golf shoes, trying to maintain his air of superiority, suddenly confronted by 2 uniformed officers. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoing across the manicured lawn. The whispers of his wealthy friends. The utter, devastating destruction of the facade he had sacrificed his own mother to build. "Thank you, Detective," I said. "The arraignment is Monday. The DA's office will be in touch. Stay safe this weekend, Mrs. Hayes." I hung up the phone. Not 30 seconds later, the screen lit up again. It was Chloe calling. I watched it ring until it went to voicemail. Immediately, a text message popped up. "Maggie, how could you? He is in jail. They took him in front of everyone. Call the cops now. Tell them it's a mistake. Please, I am begging you." Then another call. This time from Tom's cell phone, likely his one phone call from Holding, or a lawyer he had somehow managed to reach. The phone vibrated in my hand, buzzing like an angry hornet. The panic, the desperation, the demands. They were trying to reach through the digital void to pull me back into their chaos. They still thought they could control me. I looked at the screen. I thought about the dinner table, the crystal glasses, the rosemary chicken, and the cold indifference in their eyes when they told me I was nothing to them. You come last. I took the back casing off my cheap smartphone. I pulled out the battery. Then, with careful, deliberate fingers, I slid the tiny plastic SIM card out of its slot. I walked into the kitchen, picked up my heavy kitchen scissors, and cut the SIM card straight down the middle. I dropped the 2 pieces into the trash can. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It didn't ring in my ears. It was the most beautiful, peaceful sound I had ever heard. The storm was raging miles away in Lake Forest, tearing down their mansion of lies. But inside my tiny, mildew-scented apartment, the water was finally still. I made myself a fresh cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the snow fall over the city. I was entirely alone, and I had never felt safer. The wheels of the justice system turn notoriously slowly, but when they finally catch, they grind with absolute merciless precision. The next 6 months were a blur of depositions, court dates I attended quietly in the back row, and meetings with the district attorney. I watched from a distance as the polished, pristine life Tom and Chloe had built was dismantled, brick by bloody brick. The arrest at the country club had been the social death blow. The rumors spread through Lake Forest like wildfire, and the truth, that Thomas Hayes had embezzled his elderly mother's life savings to cover his day-trading gambling debts, was too scandalous even for their wealthy friends to politely ignore. They were entirely ostracized. Tom was fired from his financial firm within 48 hours of his arraignment. No wealth management company will retain an executive facing felony fraud and elder abuse charges. Without his 6-figure salary, the house of cards instantly collapsed. The bank foreclosed on the 5-bedroom mansion. The luxury SUV was repossessed from their driveway in broad daylight. To avoid serving actual time in a state penitentiary, Tom accepted a brutal plea deal. He pleaded guilty to felony financial exploitation. The judge, a stern woman who looked at my son with undisguised disgust, sentenced him to 5 years of supervised probation, 500 hours of community service, specifically cleaning up trash along the highway, and full immediate restitution of the $50,000. To pay me back, Tom was forced by court order to liquidate his entire 401k retirement account. Because of the early withdrawal penalties and taxes, it completely wiped out his future to refund my past. They moved into a cramped 2-bedroom rental apartment in a less desirable suburb. Chloe was forced to get a job as a receptionist at a dental office just to keep the lights on. The irony of it all was almost poetic. In her desperate, cruel attempt to avoid losing her status, she had guaranteed her own ruin. The day the cashier's check for $50,000 arrived in the mail from the district attorney's office, I didn't celebrate. I sat at my small kitchen table, staring at the typed numbers. It was just paper. It couldn't buy back the 5 years I had spent as their unpaid servant. It couldn't unbreak my heart. But it could buy me an exit. I gave my landlord my 30-day notice. I began packing my few belongings into cardboard boxes. I was leaving Chicago. I couldn't survive another brutal winter, and I certainly couldn't breathe the same air as the son who had tried to destroy me. On my last Sunday in the apartment, the place was mostly empty, echoing with the sound of packing tape. I was wrapping my anniversary photo of Robert in bubble wrap when a soft, hesitant knock sounded at the door. I froze. I had kept a strict no-contact order in place through my attorney. Neither Tom nor Chloe had dared to reach out, knowing it would violate Tom's probation. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. It wasn't Tom. It wasn't Chloe. It was Ethan, my grandson. He was 15 now, though in the 6 months since I had seen him, he seemed to have aged 5 years. He was taller, thinner, his shoulders hunched inside a slightly worn winter jacket. He had a backpack slung over one shoulder, and his nose was red from the cold. He had taken the city bus alone to get here. I fumbled with the deadbolt, my hand suddenly shaking, and pulled the door open. "Hi, Grandma," Ethan said, his voice cracking slightly, shifting between the pitch of a boy and a man. He looked at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. "Ethan," I breathed, my heart clenching so tightly it physically hurt. "Come in. Come inside out of the cold." He stepped into the empty apartment, looking around at the stacked boxes. He stood awkwardly in the center of the room, gripping the straps of his backpack. I wanted to throw my arms around him, to pull him close and smell his hair like I did when he was little. But there was a heavy, invisible wall between us now. The wreckage of his parents' sins. "You're moving," he said quietly. "I am," I nodded, gesturing for him to sit on the one folding chair I hadn't packed yet. "I'm heading south, to Georgia." Ethan didn't sit. Instead, he unzipped his backpack. His hands were trembling. He pulled out a small, heavy mason jar. It was filled with rolled-up dollar bills, quarters, and crinkled 5s and 10s. It was the jar he kept on his dresser, where he put his allowance and the money he made mowing lawns in the summer. He held it out to me. "Mom and Dad told Lily and me that you went crazy," Ethan said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "They said you made up lies to get Dad in trouble because you were mad at Mom. But I heard them fighting one night, after Dad got arrested. I heard him crying. He admitted it. He took your money." A tear slipped down my grandson's cheek, and he hastily wiped it away with the back of his sleeve. "I know it's not $50,000, Ethan whispered, his hand shaking as he offered me the jar. "It's only about 200, but I want you to have it. I'm sorry, Grandma. I'm so sorry for what they did to you. I didn't know. If I knew, I would have stopped them." The wall between us shattered. I didn't take the jar. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around his lanky frame, pulling him into a fierce, desperate hug. For the first time since that awful dinner, the dam broke. I cried. I wept into his shoulder, and he hugged me back, burying his face in my neck, crying like the little boy who used to scrape his knee in my backyard. We stood there in the empty apartment, holding on to each other, the last 2 survivors of a family that had destroyed itself. When I finally pulled back, I wiped his tears with my thumbs. I looked him straight in the eyes. "Ethan, listen to me," I said, my voice firm and clear. "You do not carry the weight of your parents' mistakes. What your father did is his burden, not yours. You have a good heart. You are an honest young man. Do not let their darkness change who you are." I gently pushed the mason jar back toward his chest. Keep your money, sweetheart. You save it for college. Or buy yourself a car when you turn 16. I don't need it. But I do need something else from you. I walked over to the kitchen counter, picked up a pen and a scrap of paper, and wrote down an address. I'm renting a P.O. box in Savannah, I said, folding the paper and pressing it into his hand. Do not give this to your parents, but when you want to talk, or when Lily needs her grandmother, you write to me. And when you are 18, and you are your own man, my door will always be open to you. Ethan clutched the paper like a lifeline. He nodded, gave me one last tight hug, and left to catch his bus before his parents realized he was missing. As I watched him walk down the street from my window, the final lingering shadow of bitterness left my soul. My bloodline wasn't entirely corrupted. There was still light there. I just had to step away so it could grow. 2 days later, I bought a used, thoroughly inspected Subaru, packed my boxes into the trunk, and drove out of Chicago. I didn't look back. I drove south, watching the icy, gray landscape of the Midwest slowly melt away. I drove through the mountains of Tennessee, the rolling hills of the Carolinas, and finally into the lush, humid embrace of Georgia. With every mile marker I passed, I felt a heavy layer of obligation peeling off my skin. I settled in Savannah. I found a small single-story cottage with a wraparound porch and a massive live oak tree in the front yard, dripping with silver Spanish moss. It wasn't a mansion. There were no crystal chandeliers or imported rugs. The floors creaked and the paint was slightly chipped. But it was mine. Every square inch of it was mine, paid for with my own money, maintained on my own terms. I planted blue hydrangeas and bright pink azaleas in the front yard. I joined a local book club at the library. I started taking morning walks along the cobblestone streets, stopping to buy fresh peaches at the farmer's market. I made friends. Real friends. Women my age. Widows, divorcees. Women who had survived their own storms and come out the other side with silver hair and steel spines. We drank sweet tea on my porch on warm summer evenings. We didn't talk about our ungrateful children. We talked about art, about politics, about the books we were reading, and about the sheer, intoxicating joy of answering to absolutely no one. One humid afternoon, about a year after I left Chicago, I sat on my porch in a wicker rocking chair. The ceiling fan hummed softly above me, stirring the warm, salty breeze rolling in from the coast. In my lap rested a letter from Ethan. He was a junior in high school now. He wrote about his track team, about Lily's new interest in photography, and he enclosed a picture of the two of them smiling tentatively. He wrote that things at home were hard, but that he was working a part-time job and keeping his head down. He ended the letter with, "I miss you, Grandma. I'm saving up for a bus ticket for when I graduate." I smiled, running my thumb over the photograph. They were surviving, and so was I. I leaned back in their rocking chair, listening to the cicadas sing in the oak tree. I thought back to that horrible night in the dining room, to the smell of truffle risotto and the suffocating tension. I thought of Chloe's perfectly painted lips, speaking the words that had broken my world in half. "My family comes first, Maggie. You come last." She had intended it as a curse. She had meant to put me in my place, to remind me that I was nothing more than an afterthought, a disposable tool. But sitting there, feeling the warm Georgia sun on my face, surrounded by the beautiful, quiet life I had built with my own 2 hands, I realized something profound. Chloe was right, and it was the greatest gift she could have ever given me. By putting me last on their list, she forced me to tear the list up completely. She forced me to stop begging for scraps of affection from people who only saw my utility. She forced me to finally, after 74 years of being a dutiful wife, a sacrificing mother, and an exhausted grandmother, do the one thing I had never dared to do. I put myself first. I took a sip of my iced tea, closed my eyes, and listened to the wind in the trees. I was alone, but for the first time in my entire life, I was completely, beautifully free.